The world looks to California to answer the hard questions, for redemption, to introduce the unfamiliar, to be resilient. Because California bounces back, holds us accountable, values who we are, remains vigilant, defies those in our way, and stands for community. Here on the West Coast, we're at the center of it all. Los Angeles Times, the state of what's next.
Welcome to this evening's Ideas Exchange.
When these conditions arise, we arise too.
And I think that sometimes limitation is good for artistry and good for creativity.
You're at a situation where you're like, well, is it worth it?
You cannot be an effective leader if you shortchange yourself.
I love asking why. That is my favorite question to ask, is just the why.
Take that passion and do something great with it. Save the world.
I don't have any more secrets. And that is a wonderful way to go through life.
Thank you all for watching this story, video, post, whatever this is. Thank you so much. Bye.
And good evening. I'm Eli Stokols. I'm a White House reporter for the LA Times based in Washington. Thank you all for tuning in to this Ideas Exchange, the LA Times series, where we invite newsmakers and creative thinkers to join in lively conversations that expand our knowledge, challenge our assumptions, and leave us better informed about the issues defining our time. Our guest tonight is John O. Brennan, former CIA director in the Obama administration, whose career serving in government spans more than 30 years. He's here, of course, to discuss his new memoir, Undaunted, My Fight Against America's Enemies at Home and Abroad. Director Brennan offers an insider's look at the often obscured world of national security, the intelligence profession, and Washington's chaotic political environment. I'm looking forward to this discussion going behind the scenes of some of the most crucial moments in recent U.S. history. But before we welcome Director Brennan, I want to remind viewers that Undaunted is available for purchase with a signed bookplate from Chevalier's bookstore in Los Angeles. And it is now my pleasure to welcome Director John Brennan. John, how are you?
Good evening, Eli. I'm fine, and
Great
thank
to be
you.
with you.
And thank LA Times for this opportunity tonight to talk about not just Undaunted, but also what we're experiencing right now in our country.
Yeah, there is a lot to talk about. I wanted, before we get to it, I was struck reading this book by your backstory. And, you know, I've known you a little bit from MSNBC Green Rooms. I know your voice in our national conversation, but I did not know much about your upbringing as the son of Irish immigrants in New Jersey. I had no idea that you had an earring when you were younger, that you voted in 1976 as a protest vote for the Communist Party candidate. And then you wind up in the CIA, of all places. Can you just give folks a little bit of the backstory about what it was that drew you into the CIA?
Well, you're right, Eli. I never imagined in my youth that I would wind up at the CIA and become CIA director. But I grew up in northern New Jersey, the son of an Irish immigrant. And I had the opportunity early in my life to go abroad. I went to Indonesia in the summer of my freshman year in college. My cousin was serving out there at the U.S. Embassy and spent the summer out there. Then in my junior year in college, I was at the American University in Cairo, and it introduced me to the Middle East as well as to Arabic. And so I had an intellectual curiosity and I really wanted to find out more about the world. And so when I finished up my college education and was in graduate school, I decided to apply to CIA because I thought it would give me that opportunity to go many different parts of the world, understand different cultures, and understand more about the role of the United States in the world. So it was something that, again, satisfied my curiosity about the world, my role in it. And so I was attracted to the opportunity that the CIA offered me.
Well, and you know, a remarkable career and journey that you've been on. Before we get back to some of the key elements and moments in your story, I want to ask you about something that is a little more current, something we're still learning about. the apparently Russian cyber attack on a number of government networks, including at the Treasury and Commerce departments, prompting some of those agencies to do away with very quickly a software platform that they think was compromised. Just interested how concerned you are based on what you've heard so far, what you're reading, just in terms of news reports, and how much you think this sort of attack reflects the changing nature of the kinds of national security challenges that America faces these days.
Well, just based on my reading of what is out in the press, I am very worried about what has happened. Apparently, the Russians, and this is the SVR, which is the rough equivalent of the CIA for Russia. It's a very, very capable and sophisticated cyber actor that was able to penetrate the defenses of a number of departments and agencies, get into the networks, and be there for, it seems like quite a while, months maybe, to be able to roam around in those networks and data systems and emails, and then to be able to extract information. And if you're going to do something like this from an intelligence collection standpoint, basically there are two parts to it. One is to penetrate the systems and then be able to extract the information securely. And it seems as though the Russians, or whoever were the perpetrators of this attack, were able to very cleverly get into the systems, but then even more cleverly be able to defeat the sensors that the US government has in place on these networks. It's called Einstein, which is able to detect the extract of information that goes to known IP addresses that the Russians or other intelligence services use. They extracted the information to US IP addresses and then forwarded it on to the home quarters. So it seems as though the scope was very worrisome. Department of Homeland Security, Treasury, Commerce, a number of departments and agencies, but also the duration. So I'm sure there's a frantic effort underway to try to understand what information was accessed, what was compromised. These are unclassified networks, but still they contain very, very sensitive information. Email exchanges among policymakers. They provide the Russians insight into what's going on inside the US government, but also the activities of individual US government officials. So again, I'm hoping that the professionals are going to be able to stem the bleeding on this and to be able to take corrective actions very, very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, cybersecurity really does seem like the new frontier in national security. You were CIA director in 2016 in the Obama administration when it started to become clear what Russia was trying to do to impact the 2016 presidential election. And it was difficult, I think, as you write about, for intelligence community in the US to really know how to handle this given the politics, given the timing of all of this. How much improvement did you see in our system this time around with the 2020 election?
Well, I think there were a lot of lessons learned from the 2016 election, and not just by the US government, I think also by the social media platforms. In 2016, I think there was a fair amount of arrogance on the part of social media, the Facebooks and Twitters, that did not believe that they were being exploited by the Russians, and indeed they were. The Russians did a very, very good job, aggressive job, of pushing out social media personas that purported to be US persons or entities, but they were really Russian efforts to either provide misinformation, disinformation, or propagate information that they really wanted to advance their interests. So I think in the intervening 4 years, the US government, the cybersecurity professionals, took extra steps to try to prevent any type of intrusions from going on in the electoral system. And so I do believe that Chris Krebs did a great job with his team to prevent those technical intrusions. It's those influence operations, taking advantage of that large digital domain to be able to push information out there as a way to shape the views and the votes of Americans. And so that's a real challenge for the government. How are we going to ensure that that digital environment, which is the venue for most human activity and interactions, how are we going to ensure that it continues to be a place of great vitality and freedom of speech and expression, but also do what we can to prevent it from being exploited by malactors, whether they be domestic malactors or foreign actors that try to really misinform, mislead, and then again exploit and manipulate the perceptions of individuals who are operating in that environment.
I'm just curious how you're feeling also sort of post-election, given the results and what we've really seen since the election. Obviously, you've been outspoken in your criticism of the current administration. We're going to see a new administration in Washington come January, but President Trump is still out there claiming that he won, not accepting the result, and really further attempting to politicize our elections, to politicize people like Chris Krebs, who say that the election was safe. He's trying pretty hard to get as many people as possible, it seems, to view everything through a political lens. And I just wonder how optimistic you are about the country sort of turning the page when there continues to be so much disinformation and a lot of it coming from the current occupant of the White House still.
Yeah, well, I am worried about what's going to happen between now and January 20th, because Donald Trump still has all of the authority of the President of the United States. And it should be be surprising to anyone that Donald Trump continues to deny the fact that he lost that election. And I'm sure he's going to try to do other things to try to stay in power. But there's no way on January 20th he's not going to be president any longer, and Joe Biden will be. And I do think that the Biden administration, and I know many of the individuals that he has nominated to be a part of his cabinet and national security structure, that they recognize the very daunting nature of the challenges that they face internationally, and also domestically, as far as trying to renew a sense of trust and confidence in the government that unfortunately has been rather dishonest with the American people. And so I do think one of the attributes of Joe Biden is that he's certainly not an ideologue at all. He is a very practical and pragmatic individual who has years and years of experience dealing with these issues, both domestically as well as internationally, and will take, I think, a very practical approach to these issues and not try to change things overnight, but do it in a very methodical and thoughtful fashion. And he's very serious also when he says he's going to try to do this with a bipartisan support basis. I think it's going to be challenging and difficult. Donald Trump is not going to go quietly, but again, I think his bully pulpit will become less prominent because he's not going to have that White House venue to speak from.
You took some flack. You talked about the president and pardons and maybe exacting revenge. I mean, you got under his skin clearly from some of your commentary about his administration, to the point that the White House announced that they were revoking your security clearance. And you write in the book about other things, about how you were no longer invited to the CIA holiday parties. And in writing the book, too, were denied access to your own files from the CIA. How much of an impediment was that to you in trying to go back and recall all the things about your 30 years at the CIA?
Well, yeah, this just reflects Donald Trump's, petulant nature, because he was upset that I was speaking out against him and against his dishonesty and lies. But the reason why former CIA directors retain their security clearances is not for the benefit of the individual. It's so that their successors can call them in and talk to them about different world events, want to get their perspectives about why we did this that way, and what do you think about, the head of that intelligence service, and how do you suggest that we approach certain issues? So it's really a benefit to the government. And although it was announced by the White House that he was revoking my clearances were never revoked because there was no basis to do so. But he did prohibit the CIA from sharing any classified information with me. So I wasn't able to access my files when I was CIA director. And all previous CIA directors were able to review their files as they wrote their memoirs. So I didn't have that opportunity, but I did speak to some of my former colleagues who are retired. And I do have a fairly good memory. So again, the effort by Donald Trump to stifle my speech, and as well as to send, I think, a chilling message to others that he is going to take these actions against people to retaliate against them. That is just, typical Donald Trump, that he again tries to intimidate and bully others. But clearly, that's one of the reasons why the title of my book is Undaunted. I was really undaunted by his efforts to, again, try to get back at me.
You know, the subtitle of your book, Fighting Against Enemies at Home and Abroad. I mean, do you consider the current president of the United States, an enemy of this country at home? Is that who you're referring to?
Well, there are a lot of things wrapped up in that. During the first term of the Obama administration, for the first 4 years, I served as President Obama's Homeland Security Advisor, and we are dealing with a lot of threats domestically. You know, I had to deal with a lot of incidents of domestic terrorism and with white supremacist groups and militias. Now, I think it is a very, very worrisome development. But I did lock horns with a lot of people in the Washington environment from both sides of the political aisle. I'm not a Republican or a Democrat. Worked for 6 presidents, 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans, and all of them, from Jimmy Carter to Barack Obama, I greatly respected and admired the seriousness with which they approached their duties. I didn't agree with, a number of the policies and their actions, but I did feel that they were fulfilling the role of commander-in-chief and chief executive. But Donald Trump, I felt and still feel, fell far, far short because he was pursuing a very personal political agenda that really was, I think, inconsistent with what we want in somebody who is going to serve in the office of the presidency.
I certainly understand, to the point about clearances and why former directors maintain them and why people now who are at the CIA might want to draw on your experience, because there are just so many difficult choices that confront anybody who's in the intelligence community. And you write about so many of them in this book. And there was a passage that struck me where you talk about this imperfect balance and difficult trade-offs between acting decisively against terrorists based on incomplete data in the interest of saving lives, and on the other hand, waiting for greater confidence and clarity before acting, and by waiting, risking losing the opportunity to act. The thing that jumped out at me, I don't know if you're referring to the bin Laden operation in 2011, but it seemed like that was one of the things that you could put under this umbrella, where you're really just trying, agonizing over the intelligence that you have and whether it's enough to go on. Can you take us back to those discussions in 2011 and the intelligence that seemed to suggest that it was Osama bin Laden who was that individual pacing around inside that Abbottabad, Pakistan compound, and the decision to go ahead with that, even though the intelligence, when the president decided to go with it, was nowhere close to 100%.
Yeah, you used the term agonizing, which I think is an appropriate term, because, again, during that first Obama term, I served as his Homeland Security and Counterterrorism Advisor. It was up to me to bring to the president recommendations about acting against terrorists, including taking lethal action, carrying out the strikes from drones, from predators against these hideouts where the terrorists were lurking and plotting to carry out devastating attacks against innocent men, women, and children. And the bin Laden raid was something that was the culmination of many, many years of very tedious work that the CIA and other elements of the intelligence community were engaged in the aftermath of 9/11. And so when we were at the White House, and I was President Obama's advisor, Leon Panetta came in with Michael Morrell, his deputy, in the September timeframe, and said that there was a prospect that we might have been able to identify, the CIA, the compound in Pakistan where one of bin Laden's carriers was living, which would have given us, some insight into where bin Laden was hiding. And so then in the subsequent 6 months or so, the CIA went to great lengths to try to acquire additional intelligence to give us greater confidence that bin Laden was there. And through some ingenious ways, they were able to get additional tidbits of information. But as you point out, none of it was dispositive at all that this was bin Laden. We happened to be able to observe somebody who was walking in the compound. And that's why the chapter in my book is called The Pacer. That's what we called him, the Pacer, because he would walk back and forth in sort of an exercise routine. And he seemed to be tall, but we weren't certain that that was bin Laden. So as we got more and more information, but still very limited, the president wanted us to put together some plans to action that compound. And the military had come up with several, including missile strikes against the compound, which were dismissed because we First of all, didn't want to, cause dozens, if not more, casualties in the surrounding area. But also, a missile strike would not have given us the confidence that it was bin Laden, in fact, that was at that compound and whether or not he was killed. And so it was decided that it would be an assault by U.S. Navy SEALs aboard these helicopters that would fly in from Afghanistan. And I detail in the book, all of the meetings that we had in the White House Situation Room that were cloaked in clandestinity as far as ensuring that no word got out because we were very concerned that a leak could lead to bin Laden leaving the compound. But we also found out that if this helicopter assault was going to take place, so we had to do it by the lunar cycle because we wanted to make sure there was minimal amount of moonlight. So every 28 days or so, there'd be a 2 or 3 day window. And so it was finally decided that at the end of April, the first day of May, was the time that President Obama decided to give the go-ahead. And there were a lot of people in the White House, particularly his political advisors, that really were cautioning him against approving this raid because if bin Laden wasn't there, or if there was some very nasty, accident or firefight or something that led to the deaths of, many U.S. Navy SEALs, it would have been a real political blow to Barack Obama's chances for re-election. But one of the things I admired about President Obama was that he said on numerous occasions, I don't care about the politics, it's the right thing to do, which I think is what really every president, should say and do when they're faced with these types of choices. So he made the courageous decision to go ahead. U.S. Navy SEALs are just tremendously, brave and talented individuals that carried out that operation flawlessly and were able to, again, bring justice to bin Laden.
And, it was such a moment of national catharsis. Obviously, the risks were huge, but in a sense, it worked out. And there are other aspects to foreign policy matters, intelligence gathering, national security that are maybe more complicated, don't quite have the happy ending, so to speak, for Americans. And I want to ask you a little bit about the enhanced interrogation techniques that were adopted after the 9/11 attacks. You talk about trying to balance these things: national security, morality, America's example to the rest of the world, respect for civil liberties enshrined in the Constitution, and how in the book you write that when you found out, when you read the reports about what was happening, you needed to take a walk and leave the building. You said, "My God, what are we doing?" And you said that it was the first time in 20 years with the CIA that you were confronting an activity that you found morally repugnant. But this program continued. Can you talk about how difficult this was and what the various factors are? Because I know a lot of your critics have said, well, John Brennan allowed this to continue. He may say he was against it, but he allowed this to continue and push back against some of the lawmakers who are trying to bring this to light. Can you take us back to some of those discussions and talk about how you grappled with this dilemma?
Yeah, we're almost 20 years removed from 9/11, and I do think the context of that time period is important. 3,000 individuals killed as a result of those attacks. We had anthrax attacks in Washington, D.C. We had the Washington sniper. We also had, clear intelligence that Al-Qaeda was planning to carry out second and third waves of attacks, and they had planned a wave of attacks using aircraft against the west coast of the United States. They also were looking into WMD, weapons of mass destruction, biological, chemical, and nuclear. So there was a real sense that we were facing this existential threat, and it was a race against time. And so at the time then, George W. Bush and the White House decided that they needed to ensure that the CIA had as much insight as possible into what Al-Qaeda was planning. And so there was a worldwide roundup of Al-Qaeda operatives at that time, and there was a decision made that those individuals that were captured or arrested or detained by other countries would be turned over to the United States for interrogation. And the CIA was tapped to set up this detention program and this interrogation program. It's very unfortunate because CIA had no history in having a detention program or conducting interrogations. Looking back on it now, I think the U.S. military should have been the detainees and detainers, and that the FBI should have been doing the interrogations. But CIA was directed to do it, and the President of the United States issued what is called a finding or a memorandum of notification that authorizes the CIA to conduct this covert action program. And that program was reviewed by the Department of Justice, the highest legal advisory body within the Department of Justice, which is the Office of Legal Counsel. And it determined that that program was lawful. So CIA basically had a responsibility and obligation to carry out a duly authorized lawful program to try to protect the United States national security. At the time, I was the Deputy Executive Director of CIA, so I was not in the chain of command for any of these programs. It was the equivalent of sort of the Deputy Chief Operating Officer. But I was a very senior official, and I was aware of the program, but not the details. And as you point out, when I read a cable that provided very graphic and stomach-turning details about a waterboarding session, I took a walk because I really did think that it shocked my conscience. I expressed my reservations and concerns about this, including with the director of CIA at the time, George Tenet. But again, the CIA had all of the appropriate authorizations, and this was something that was also briefed to Congress, and money was appropriated for it. And so looking back now, in 2020 hindsight, a lot of people who say, how could that ever have been done? Well, it was, again, a race against time to prevent al-Qaeda from carrying out what could have been a much more catastrophic attack against the United States. So I say in the book that I feel as though I had a sin of omission, that although I did, talk to people about it, I didn't rap my fist on the table. I didn't talk more in an outspoken way about, what I thought was a program that was unethical, unprincipled, and immoral. It was a covert action program, so I and other CIA officers were prohibited from talking about it, publicly. But when I became CIA director, I vowed publicly that I would never reinstitute that program, either the detention or the interrogation program, at CIA as long as I was director.
And you were part of an accounting for this program. You wanted as much as possible to be made public, but also struggled with efforts to, I think, denigrate the individuals who carried out this program, because you've also pointed out, as you just did, that it was deemed to be sort of within the legal bounds. Obviously, pretty complicated, having personal opposition to something, but being part of this chain of command, and then afterwards also being responsible for a sort of public reckoning, and also trying to protect the parts of it that are classified.
Yes, and I have objected to the use of the term torture in terms of referring to what CIA officers did on that program, because, again, the Department of Justice determined it was lawful, and by definition, then, anything that was lawful was not torture in the United States, government legal context. Now, I disagreed with the Department of Justice memos that were written at the time. I don't think that they're worth the paper they were written on. But yet it still had all of the trappings of a legal, duly authorized program. And so that program did haunt me, if you will, through the course of my career. And when I was CIA director, I had to work with the Congressional Committee of the Senate Intelligence Committee that was putting together a report on that program, which I thought was very one-sided. It was carried out by the Democrats on the committee. It was written by staffers on the Democratic side, who I think were very much interested in trying to denigrate, disparage, the work that the agency did. I think it skewed its perspective. The CIA made a number of mistakes, didn't manage the program well. There were individual officers that exceeded the boundaries of what they were authorized to do. We acknowledged those mistakes, but I was not going to just turn a blind eye to what I thought was a rather partisan effort to try to, again, blame the CIA for a policy in the Bush administration that many people, including myself, had some real serious problems and concerns about.
I know you don't like the term torture, but I just want to push you a little bit on this. You mentioned that, well, it doesn't amount to torture because it was deemed to be legal. But as someone who read those files and who had, that stomach-churning response to it, do you personally believe that those actions that were undertaken to another human being at Guantanamo, do you believe that equates to torture or not?
Well, torture has a lot of, the term torture, the word torture has a lot of implications, including on the legal front. And so individuals who carry out torture can be indicted, both in international courts as well as in domestic courts. And so therefore, I think we'd be very careful. You know, the term torture is used in sort of in a general sense about sort of outrageous actions and activities that are perpetrated on individuals. But it's the legal baggage of torture that I felt an obligation to CIA officers who were trying to fulfill their responsibilities as CIA officers, and they were told by CIA lawyers as well as Department of Justice lawyers that this was an appropriately authorized program. And if they conducted their activities within the four corners of what was authorized, to me, they were not involved in the unlawful practice of torture. Now, those individuals who exceeded those lawful boundaries, I think you can make a case. But again, I'm not going to put a legal label on what individuals did because of, again, the implications of that type of charge.
That makes sense. And I appreciate the candor and the reflectiveness, the self-reflection that's in this book, especially about this subject. You know, and summing up one of these chapters, you said that you asked if the program, and I'm quoting here, if it was proportional to the seriousness of the threat. Did it take greater moral courage, you asked, to refuse to implement the program or to allow it to take place? In the book, it doesn't seem like you really ever arrived at an answer to that question. Is that a point that you have decided, or is it still just too difficult to determine on which side of that you fall?
Well, you know, the law is the law in terms of it's referred to as black letter law. You know, but morality is something that is not inscribed or codified, you know, in law. It is something that is very personal. What I may consider immoral, another person may not. And so there is a very highly subjective quality to it. I've talked to a lot of people who were involved in the program, who actually ran some of these detention sites, as well as the senior CIA officials who had to give those authorizations and directives. And listening to them, they agonized over it themselves, you know, in terms of what to do. And when they would think about, you know, those people who jumped out of the windows of the World Trade Center and, you know, crushed their lives and their families' lives, they really felt that they had this obligation to do everything possible to find out what other attacks were being planned so that they could stop them. So yes, I can pass my own judgment on others in terms of, you know, what I consider to be moral or not. But that's why I think for CIA officers in particular, I think there are standards of institutional ethics and principles that the senior managers need to be thinking about. Having a program be lawful, I think, is a very necessary but insufficient condition of going forward with a program. Is it ethical? Is it principled? Is it consistent with our values? And that's where I think the CIA leadership has to make some determinations. And then individuals who are being asked to carry out these programs have to ask themselves, does this comport with my own sense of what I am morally sort of, you know, allowed to do, or what I should not do because it is, again, inconsistent with what I think is appropriate behavior, even on the part of CIA officers.
Can I ask you sort of another question about sort of the morality of drones and the use of drones? You defended the use of drones as CIA director. You said they've, you know, helped in the sort of war against terror. There's a lot of criticism about the over-reliance on drones. What would you say to people who, you know, see that as a new aspect and don't like the looks of that either? What are the benefits? What are the I mean, when you weigh the pros and cons, where do you come out on that still?
Yeah, a lot of people have raised this issue about, you know, the morality of drones, which, and I can understand the question because there's a lot of misunderstanding about drones. These are remotely piloted aerial platforms that carry missiles that can launch missiles with tremendous accuracy and precision because they're laser guided from miles away on a target within inches of, you know, the intended target. And so they also have the ability to dwell over targets for extended periods of time. And so from the standpoint of an instrument of war, which is what we're talking about, the ability to use these drones in a much more accurate, precise manner and reduce civilian casualties or non-combatant casualties, there is a much greater opportunity to do it with these drones than with missile strikes that go against a target based on the predetermined coordinates, or from an aircraft launching from miles away, but it's not able to dwell over the target and continually sort of monitor developments there. So it is a very, very powerful weapon of war that I don't think should be over-relied on, as you point out. In the Obama administration, we had put together a policy framework that any type of strike against a terrorist target, whether it be with a drone or with a missile, with aircraft, it should be the very last option available, and it should be only used if there was no other way to stop some type of terrorist attack from taking place against a target of innocence. And so I know a lot of people think that this was just something that we opted for, quickly. No, we didn't. But when there were, truck bombs heading to our embassies, when there were Al-Qaeda operatives who were taking improvised explosive devices to airports to put on an aircraft, when the last opportunity we had to interdict that type of operation was to take a strike as they were in a vehicle on the way to the embassy or the airport, because if we didn't, they would have gotten there and we wouldn't have had the opportunity to stop it. So Barack Obama was a very, very, morally just and judicious person as far as using this tremendously powerful capability only when we had to, and when there was no opportunity for any other way to stop that terrorist attack. There was no option to capture or detain the terrorist, either by ourselves or local forces. So unfortunately, there's been a lot of misrepresentation in the press. Some of it, I think, has been intentional by those who just have this, view that this is an awful instrument, an amoral instrument of war. But I must tell you that if some type of offensive action needs to be taken against a terrorist target, I would prefer it be done by these platforms that, again, have tremendous ability to put ordnance on target with amazing, amazing precision.
These wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, they went on for such a long time, and the country has grown tired of them, obviously. And you talked about the Obama decision to authorize the raid on the bin Laden compound and said that he did not really worry too much about the politics. But in the book, it's clear that at various times, throughout these wars, you have felt like some of the decisions that have been made by different administrations, not just the Bush administration, but also the Obama administration in terms of troop surges and troop withdrawals, were maybe driven a little more than you felt comfortable with by domestic politics. Can you give us a sense of that?
Well, one of the things that I came to realize working in the White House was that the information flows that go into the Oval Office are many and diverse. And so there's an intelligence feed, there's military advice, there's diplomatic recommendations, but there also are political advisors and political considerations. And what can you do and get congressional support for something? And how can you reach across the aisle and get Republicans or the Democrats to support your initiatives? And so all of these considerations have to be taken into account when there's going to be some decision made about taking some action that may be highly controversial as well as highly risky. And so, thinking about Iraq and Afghanistan over the years, there have been people on both ends of the spectrum. Those who think that we should stay in those countries with a large amount of troops, and those that think that we have been there way too long already. And they have some very justifiable, feelings on this and argumentation. And it's up to a president of the United States to take in those, recommendations and views, and then try to make the best decision that he or she believes is in the interests of U.S. national security. But during the Obama administration, whether it be intervention in Libya or decisions about troop surges or reductions in places like Afghanistan, pulling out of Iraq, completely back in 2012. These were things that certainly had consequences, and again, people I think argued with real conviction on all sides of the issue. Different people had different perspectives, and one of the things I think is important for a president is to ensure that there's going to be this airing of these different views. Because if you're just going to have a bunch of yes people there, you're never going to be able to make the most appropriate decision. So yeah, political considerations come into national security decisions, but I'd like to believe that at least during the Obama administration, when President Obama made these decisions, he took into account those political considerations, but made the decision that he thought was going to best protect U.S. national security as well.
One last thing I would just want to touch on before we get to some of the questions that were submitted from our attendees is where you opened the book. In December of 2016, after the election, you were among 4 people who went to Trump Tower, 4 government officials, intelligence officials who went to Trump Tower for the first time to brief the president-elect Donald Trump. And this was the same day that you had to go after this to New Jersey to bury your father. An emotional day, a really vivid rendering of a day in your life, momentous day in your life to open this book. But I want to just ask you about that briefing in Trump Tower and what that was like, because you write pretty bluntly that every other president you were around, you respected. You said this tonight. And when you were in Trump Tower and you were there briefing Donald Trump, you just had a different feeling. Can you just describe that scene a little bit for folks tonight?
Yeah. Jim Clapper, the director of national intelligence, Jim Comey, the director of FBI, Mike Rogers, the director of NSA, and I were charged with briefing then President-elect Trump in the Trump Tower in early January on the intelligence community assessment that was done on Russian attempts to interfere in the presidential election. And so we were in a conference room, and he and Mike Pence and Pompeo and Reince Priebus and Mike Flynn and a few other people who came in. The briefing took place in about an hour and a half or so. And as you point out, I felt that his questions were not really trying to understand the truth of what the Russians were doing. I think he was trying to understand what we knew and how we knew it. And he was also trying to put out sort of contrarian views about who might have been responsible for it. Several times he interjected, well, it could have been the Chinese. It could have been the Chinese. And there was not a single doubt in our minds that this was a very determined and concerted Russian effort to interfere in the election. And it just, I had the real sense that has been reinforced over the last 4 years that, again, Donald Trump is not carrying out the duties of the office the way previous presidents did, which was, again, trying to do their utmost to protect the national security interests of the United States and the safety and security of American citizens. He seems to be approaching things with a single-minded prism of what makes most sense for his political and personal interests. And that briefing, as we went through in detail, what it is that we had uncovered and what was the unanimous assessment of the authors of this assessment, that the Russians were interfering on his behalf and trying to hurt Hillary Clinton, and that this was being done at Vladimir Putin's direction. He basically was denying the fact, and he then denied it publicly. The following year, when he took the stage in Helsinki with Vladimir Putin, where he basically said he saw no reason why the Russians would have been behind this effort to interfere in the election. And I guess it was his, dismissive attitude of the intelligence assessment. But more than that, it was more of his disparagement and denigration of the tremendous work of the intelligence professionals that really got my anger up, and which is why I decided then to speak out. I never thought I would be as outspoken as I've been in my retirement, but these are very abnormal times. But again, it was a very memorable event. As you point out, my father had passed away the week before, and so the entire month of December and the first part of January, when my father was gravely ill and then passed away. And as I said in the book, my father was sort of the moral, intellectual, and ethical antithesis of Donald Trump. It made me see Donald Trump for his many, many flaws.
I want to spend the last 15 or 20 minutes that we have going through a few questions. We've got dozens and dozens of submissions from attendees who are online with us tonight. We appreciate all of those. I want to start with a question from Courtney. And the question is, term consequences on functional democracy of the continued introduction of disinformation into the democratic information ecology?
Yeah, that's sort of the $64 million question. As I mentioned before, this digital domain that we rely on so heavily for communication and for information, it is in many respects a wild west that people can put anything up there that they want. It doesn't have to be truthful or accurate. In fact, much of it is not. And so what is the role of the government? Does the government have a responsibility to try to ensure that there's going to be some modicum of accuracy in information that gets up there? No, it sort of, contravenes the concept of freedom of speech. Freedom of speech doesn't say true and accurate speech, it just says speech. So, I'm hoping that as we look into the future, there's going to be some way that the average American can go to some source that's going to be nonpartisan, apolitical, as objective as possible for a reality check. You're going to have both political parties, the main political parties, giving their own version of the truth and trying to shape attitudes and views. So that disinformation is not just coming from overseas, a lot of disinformation coming from domestic actors. And I do think that, our society, our government really needs to try to come to terms with this digital environment that where most human activity is taking place, and not have it be some place that is going to be easily exploited and manipulated by those who seek to do us harm by, again, misinforming, misleading, and misrepresenting the truth.
Just a quick follow-up on that, though, just thinking of something that you wrote in the book about social media being something where a lot of this disinformation is actually right out in the open. If you're in intelligence, does the proliferation of social media make it easier? I think you said that maybe the CIA was a little slow to realize how much information was just sort of sitting there in plain sight on these platforms. Has that helped in some ways, even though it's obviously dangerous and you're worried about it, in terms of intelligence gathering? Does social media offer you a trove of information if you know where to look?
Well, it can, certainly. And I think in the book, I do criticize the intelligence community. I think we could have done a better job during the Arab Spring and in the advance of the Arab Spring, because there were a lot of things that were coming out in social media that really did reflect just how dry the political tinder was in the region. And I think by tapping into the available information that comes out in social media, there's a better opportunity to get a sense of the pulse of the street. Certainly politicians and government officials do it around the globe. That's one of their ways that they are able to understand which way the political winds are blowing. And so in one area, it does give us better insight, but another area, terrorists and proliferators and authoritarians and others exploit that environment as well. So just like many of the other technological advancements that we have seen over the last several decades, it's a double-edged sword.
Okay, this next question is from Ray, and the question is, what lasting effect do you think that Trump and his denial of election results based on unproven facts will have on American politics and the threat of foreign interference in future elections compared to 2016?
Well, I do think that Donald Trump is really quite an aberration, and I'm hoping that we're not going to have a repeat of someone who really has no respect for the law or norms and standards and decency and dignity in office ever is going to be at the White House again. That said, though, I have been just appalled at how many individuals really continue to cater and enable his every action and whim. So I do think the damage has been, significant. He has fueled this polarization within this country. I do think we need to try to bring down the temperature of the animus that exists between the left and the right. I think Joe Biden really does believe in being a centrist as far as leading for all Americans in trying to heal the divisions and the rifts that have taken place. But I do think that we're going to have quite a challenge in trying to build back trust in our election system because of the portrayal of widespread fraud that Donald Trump continues to purvey. But also, I think there's going to be a big challenge for the Biden administration to build back trust internationally in the word of the United States, because I think the last 4 years have demonstrated that Donald Trump will say whatever he wants, irrespective of its validity, if he believes it's going to advance his interests. And that is a very dangerous phenomenon for a president of the United States to be viewed as somebody who is, just engages in wholesale dishonesty.
Well, and we've seen so much division seemingly inflamed by a lot of the rhetoric coming out of the White House and out of Washington lately. And I want to ask another somewhat related question that comes from Amber. The United States, she writes, has a long history of race-based domestic terrorism. Do you think it gets the same attention as terrorism from abroad? And what can the local and federal government do better to address homegrown race-based domestic terror?
Well, it certainly hasn't received as much attention as international terrorism over the past 20 years because of the attacks that Al Qaeda has carried out. But I agree with the premise of the question, which is it deserves a lot more attention. And certainly during the last number of years, 8 or 10 years, the FBI has been more and more focused on these domestic hate groups, whether they be white supremacist groups, militias, or whatever, because there is real concern that, first of all, the availability of weapons give these individuals and groups the wherewithal to carry out violent acts. But also there are international connections. There's similarities and connections between domestic groups here in the United States and neo-Nazi groups or other types of far right-wing groups in other countries, particularly in Europe. So I think some of the growth of these groups here domestically is being abetted by forces outside of this country. And it is a very, very, I think, worrisome development, again, that has been, in some respects, accelerated by the unfortunate demagoguery that is coming out of the White House over the last number of years.
I mean, are you worried when you see what we saw over the weekend in Washington with the Stop the Steal rally, and you have people who are armed, who are starting fights on the street? You have threats to lawmakers in places like Michigan who are trying to certify their election results. I mean, how worrisome is this? You worried about what the president might do in the last 30 days, but are you worried about the country in terms of where it sits right now and what we may have in front of us?
Well, I am worried. I'm not worried from the standpoint of that this country is going to devolve into, chaos and, civil war. No. But I am concerned that some individuals or groups of individuals will decide to engage in what they believe is, vigilante justice and carry out actions, violent actions against groups that they oppose because they think that these are individuals who are contrary to, the American way and spirit. And so there's, again, a lot of misperceptions of, other groups and the reason why we have problems here in the United States. But again, it's the availability of so much weaponry here in the United States that, and as I look at some of the rhetoric that is coming out, whether it be on social media or even things that officials, public officials who should know better and do know better, but they seem to, relish antagonizing, some of these groups as a way to provoke them into confrontation. And, unfortunately, as I have seen around the globe, sometimes it just takes a spark to set off a much larger, issue and problem. And I'm hoping that's not going to happen here in the United States.
Another pressing matter is what Wendy is asking about. Her question is, how is the intelligence bureaucracy pivoting to adapt to evolving global threats due to climate destabilization?
Well, I think over the last 2 decades, there has been an effort to try to have a better understanding of how some of these global climatic changes really have national security and international stability implications. Al Gore was certainly somebody who had pushed this during the Clinton administration. And so looking at issues related to the changing weather patterns and how it's going to affect agricultural production in different countries and the economic implications of that, rising seas and how coastal communities are going to be pushed inland and the additional pressure is going to put on urban centers, and what are the challenges then that are going to accrue to governments that are dealing with these problems. The melting of the Arctic ices and how that's going to spur competition between countries for these raw earth minerals and other types of resources up there. So there are a lot of things that taking place that also with the increasing the climate change and weather patterns that lead to migrations of individuals across borders and the pressures that then different countries feel. We saw that in Europe and continue to see it in terms of migration out of Africa. So there are very significant and potentially very destabilizing consequences as a result of these climatic changes. And that's why I'm very glad that President-elect Biden selected John Kerry to be the climate czar on the international front, because it has real implications for interstate relations, global stability, and it's just going to get worse or more intense, with emissions and fossil fuels. Just there's so much again that has real reverberations on the political, economic, social, cultural forces in the world today.
A couple more questions before we run out of time here. Richard asks, what steps do you think Congress should take to prevent future presidents from corrupting our information security agencies? I know you said you believe that the Trump experience may be an outlier, but it's a question that the country has to probably confront now in a way that maybe over the course of your career you never thought you'd have to answer.
Yeah, well, I do think, it's really going to be incumbent on Congress to take some of these actions. But I was watching the Homeland Security Committee hearing in the Senate today, which was, unfortunately, it devolved into real partisan fighting. And I really wish that, more politicians would set aside their party affiliations and be looking at these issues from a very, very important sort of national security perspective as opposed to from a political or partisan perspective. So I do think it's important that we take a fresh look, and it might be that it has to be outside of Congress, and we have some type of independent commission that is going to come up with a series of recommendations, just like what happened after the 9/11 attacks and the WMD commission after the invasion of Iraq, to try to correct some of these actions of the government that really have tremendous consequences for our safety and security. So I do think Congress can authorize an independent bipartisan commission to carry out its work and to come forward with recommendations to the executive branch as well as to the Congress. That's probably the best way to go, because these congressional committees, unfortunately, are a good example of dysfunctional government too often.
Okay, a big sweeping question from Matthew will be our last question. We'll finish here. He asks, what do you consider is our most pressing national security threat? And what can an ordinary citizen like myself do to prepare for it?
Most pressing national security threat, outside of the partisan environment in Washington these days, because I do think that is a very, very serious threat. The challenge for the United States, unlike almost any other country in the world, is that we really have these, I think, exceptional global responsibilities. And so we have to be, concerned about, relations with other world powers, China and Russia. We have to be concerned about proliferation and terrorism and global stability and, climate and other things. We do have this exceptional responsibility. And I talked before about the digital domain, which is, ubiquitous, and it doesn't respect sovereign borders and how it's being exploited by malactors. So I think the greatest national security threat that the next administration and subsequent administration is going to face is, how do you ensure that you are looking at the near term, the medium term, and the longer term threats appropriately, and you're allocating your resources, your your focus, your personnel, your energies, your intelligence collection systems, your diplomatic efforts, your military presence. How are you doing that with a mind to addressing not just those wolves near the door, but those wolves down the street and the wolves, in the next town? And unfortunately, given our political cycles, between congressional elections and presidential elections, too often we look at things in these, election cycles and what can be done in 2 years or 4 years, while a lot of these issues really require much more enduring strategic approaches, and so that we're not going to be whipsawing back and forth from, one administration or one party in power to another. To me, that's the totality of it, and dealing with these issues simultaneously and dealing with them in the appropriate fashion. That, to me, is the greatest sort of threat. If I were to pick out one among all of those, it's probably in the digital cyber environment, because that touches all of the other issues. And it is an arena, a realm that I don't think the United States or even other countries have really come to grips with in terms of what's the appropriate role of government in that digital environment, which is much different than the physical environments. What is the appropriate role of the CIA and FBI and NSA to monitor threats in that environment, while at the same time not abridging privacy and civil liberties? That, to me, is the most mind-numbing, challenging problem that we face. And just like we had these recent, cyber attacks by Russia, this is just again, a symptom and a feature of what I think is a more sort of globally encompassing challenge of how is that digital environment going to continue to be the engine for prosperity and growth, as opposed to being a source of, demise.
Well, you brought us full circle there, because that's where we started this conversation. I'm tempted to leave it right there because it just ties together so neatly. But one final question, just stepping back and really widening the aperture here. The role of America in the world is thought to be one thing for a long time, kind of the pillar of the post-war democratic order. But we're just living in a different world these days. You talk about the new frontier of cybersecurity. We have China is in a different place than it was before. Europe is now talking about sort of separating and trying to become more independent from the United States. You have globalization that is a fact. You have really just a different world. And I wonder if you think it's realistic for America to sort of be the same kind of superpower that it was during the Cold War and in the years following the Cold War. I mean, is that the right role for America to play in the world right now? What is America's place in the world, in the year 2020, heading into 2021?
Yeah, it's a great question, probably the appropriate one to sort of maybe end the discussion on. But let me make 3 principal points. One is, clearly, globalization continues apace. The world is much more intimate, much more interconnected than it's ever been before in terms of communication and interaction and the sharing of ideas and capabilities. And people who sort of are opposed to globalization, they just, are ignoring the reality of the world. And globalization has had a tremendously positive impact, around the globe, depending on where you live, though. But the impact of globalization has been rather uneven within countries and between countries. And so I think this is something that, our government and other governments are going to have to be dealing with as we continue along this technologically driven globalization path that I believe is inevitable. Second point is that I do believe in American exceptionalism, not because we're bigger or better or smarter or better looking than anybody else. It's because when you look at the country of the United States, it is unrivaled in terms of having the combination of large country with tremendous arable lands, navigable rivers, large seacoasts, tremendous bounty of natural resources. It's the world's melting pot. It has all of those features that really are the ingredients of success. And I do believe that with those exceptional good fortune come exceptional responsibilities in terms of trying to ensure that we're able to leverage, that great good fortune, not only to advance ourselves, but also to try to ensure that the world, which we're a part of, is going to also grow and be able to prosper. And that's why this very shrill mantra of America first, really does rub so many people the wrong way around the globe, because they feel as though the United States is going to use its muscularity on the economic, on the military, on the political front, and all the fronts to advantage itself at the disadvantage of others. And so I do believe that the United States really needs to show sort of the way. First of all, we're the leading, Western liberal democratic, society, to be the country that is going to speak out against human rights atrocities, human rights abuses, to advocate for greater political participation of people around the globe, so that people can realize, what I think is, the human potential, and not just be thinking about ourselves and pitting ourselves against the rest of the world. That I think is wrong. So we have played this very important leadership role, certainly over the last 75 years or so, since World War II. It's a different world than it was in those decades after World War II. It's no longer a bipolar world between the Soviet Union and the United States. It's more of a multipolar world, and have to deal with a rising China, a revanchist Russia, but also a lot of other groups out there. But I do think, as Joe Biden says, we don't lead by the example of our power. It's the power of our example. And I think that is a very, very important, component of who we are and how we define ourselves. And so looking out over the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years, I can't even imagine how much the world is going to change in that time frame, because it has changed so much just in my, 65 years of life. And so I think we really need to be trying to, if not lead the way, just to try to demonstrate how a government and a society can thrive, and do it in a manner that is going to be working collaboratively with the rest of the world. And then the final point is, one of the reasons why I wrote this book was to try to lift the shroud off of national security and intelligence. I believe very, very strongly in public service. And as I say in the preface of the book, one of the principal reasons I wrote it, aside from just trying to correct a lot of misimpressions that are out there about the intelligence world, but also I want to encourage young Americans, across this country and this great melting pot of America, to think seriously about pursuing public service. It's a great, wonderful country. We have the great benefit of living here. And as my father, who was an immigrant and a naturalized U.S. citizen, told me and my siblings never to take our citizenship for granted, and to give back to this great country of ours. So I'm hoping that by, telling some stories about my life in national security and intelligence, that I might entice, some of the best and brightest of the younger generation of Americans to seriously consider, whether it's pursuing a diplomatic, profession, or military, or law enforcement, or intelligence, or working with state and local, communities and governments, giving back to this great country of ours. Because although we certainly have our flaws and we've made a lot of mistakes, I think we have rightful pride when we say that we are a citizen of the United States of America. And I do believe that the future, despite maybe some speed bumps, is going to be bright. And I do believe that this country is going to thrive in the future. So.
Well, we can definitely leave it on that note. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, Director Brennan. Really appreciate it. It's great to chat with you, and really a phenomenal read. And before we sign off, I do want to remind everyone watching that Undaunted is available for purchase with a signed book plate from Chevalier's bookstore in Los Angeles. Thank you to all of you who tuned in tonight for this discussion. We hope it was worth your time. And we hope you'll join us again on our next LA Times Ideas Exchange. I'm Eli Stokols in Washington. Until next time, good night.